right, Hibakusha. Um, and so she was born 3 years after the bombing of Hiroshima, um, but is nowadays resident in South Wales. And it's because of CND Cymru that it has been arranged that she can address us. So, Kyoko, would you like to begin addressing us directly? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. I think Brian heard my experience before, but I do like to share my experience. I was born in 1948, 3 years after the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. I am second generation of Hibakusha. Hibakusha means
Oh, you can
um,
now.
Yeah, I listened to it on here.
That's a change.
Yeah.
No, I want to.
it's all right to continue.
I think you continue. Somebody else was speaking, but let's try to allow Kyoko to be the one speaker now. Back to you.
Hibakusha means um, survivor of bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I shall begin by saying that because English is my second language, and talking about my experience in Hiroshima is very difficult even now. So, as not to become emotional, I will read directly from my prepared note. I hope you don't mind. The latest GI President Joseph Toda made a historical declaration about the abolition of nuclear weapons on the 8th of September 1957 in front of 50,000 young people. His aim was to establish the idea that the use of a nuclear weapon was an act that would deny humanity its fundamental right to exist. He hoped that by allowing this idea to penetrate deeply into the heart and the mind of people throughout the world, particularly the leaders in each country, and by establishing this internal criterion, he would prevent the use of nuclear weapons. He meant to crush the tendency in the people's mind to justify the use of nuclear weapons. Mr. Toda was thus convinced that it is the existence of Buddha nature within human beings that would guarantee the abolition of nuclear weapons without fail. Since human being created the atomic bomb, it must also be human being that make possible its abolition. Mr. Toda's true reason for this declaration was that nuclear weapons and their use must be absolutely condemned, not from the standpoint of ideology, nationalism, or ethnic identity, but instead from the universal dimension of humanity. Nobody has the right to take precious life. Everybody has the right to live life. Because life is the most precious of all things. On the 6th of August 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima with a population of 350,000. Hiroshima was apparently chosen because of the clear sky overhead that day. Good visibility made it easy to observe the destructive capacity of this new nuclear technology. Under that mushroom cloud, rising out of a temperature of 5,000 degrees, some say 7,000 degrees centigrade. As we know, 100 degrees, water boils at 100 degrees and steel melts at 1,500 degrees. 70,000 died instantly, and many more afterwards. So within 4 months, 140,000 died. And to this day, people continue to die from radiation-related illnesses. The actual dropping of a bomb took only 10 seconds, but the effect have continued and will continue for generations. I was brought up in community filled with the family suffering tremendously from the effect of a bomb. Although I was born 3 years after the bomb was dropped, no information was available as to the possible consequences. Because of that, people were ignorant of the effect of radiation. We grew and ate vegetables from contaminated soil and ate fish from the polluted sea. However, people like me and the others who were indirectly affected by the bombing that day are not counted among the statistics. Even now, there is a lot of suffering behind the closed doors. Marriage is very difficult as it may produce babies with physical challenges. People had lost hope and confidence for the future because they felt that they didn't have the ability to provide for and care for their family and uncounted atomic orphans. We cannot imagine what kind of life they lived and who were never mentioned. There was high suicide rates among victims and their families. And we did not use a condition called PTSD at that time. But there were many people who had PTSD. They saw loved ones who were melting in the front of their eyes. They witnessed the horror of many burned people crawling to the rivers and dying in the water. This was an absolute land of hell, man-made hell. The war and using atomic bomb does not create any value, only suffering and misery on humanity. I remember when I was small, even though nobody told me, but I knew not to stare or ask questions about the people whose skin had melted with the intense heat. My family was no exception. Exception. All were affected physically and mentally in one way or another. I was affected more than my siblings and had the most difficulty with my health. The only explanation was the after effect of radiation. Although mental and emotional stress that each of us bore, because we didn't know what illness could be residing in our bodies and whether they could be passed on to unknowingly to our children and grandchildren. One family I remember had their whole skin burned off by the heat. When you are skinless, your body is shiny and pink and in agony. It was horrendous to see. Some people managed to live on for years like this. Another neighbor had such a huge burn scar on his back that he looked a bit like a tortoise with a shell. One day, the scar became very itchy, and his family said it was moving. Suddenly, from underneath the scar came a huge amount of pus and live maggots. I can never forget those images. And even now, after so many years, it is very difficult to talk about it. Can you imagine if you had lived with and watch those you care for and love undergoing such excruciating suffering. I was the weakest child in the family. I was told by my doctor that I had only a 50% effective immune system. So far, I have had lymph nodes and the cancer removed. The last cancer operation was 13 months ago. 16 stitches all over my body now. But doctors in Japan and in the UK are not able to say these are an effect of how I lived in radiation-filled environment. When I was a little older, I used to be involved in the peace movement. I carried a placard to demonstrate for peace. No more bombing, no more war, no more Hiroshima. Each time before I left home to take part in demonstration, my mother would gently shake her head and said, "You cannot change people's heart by carrying a placard." I would say, "I know, mother, but I want to change the world and change it now." But she never stopped me from doing it. However, she did ensure that I continued to practice the philosophy of deeply respecting the dignity of life. One day I heard a head of state say that he was horrified to hear what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after giving a long speech with many condolences, then said, "But I'm glad this didn't happen to us." This statement horrified me, and I realized that we have a tendency to think, "Thank goodness that wasn't me." It was then that I realized the truth of what my mother had said. This was my turning point. When scientists developed the atomic bomb, and when these in power decided to use this weapon on people, and the bomber pushed the button, did they think that their action would have such devastating effect on all of these individuals who had names, faces, and felt the joy and the sorrow of life? In September 2000, I returned to nurse my dying mother in a hospital in Hiroshima, which treated radiation victims. The doctors gave my mother 2 weeks to live, and my sister and I stayed with her around the clock. One day I heard a voice from the radio coming from the next room to my mother. I soon realized that it wasn't the radio, but an elderly lady repeating over and over and again, "Mommy, it hurts. Mommy, it hurts." She was a little girl again, calling out to her mother. She was a survivor of the atomic bombing, who had lived so long and was ending her life in this way. When her sound stopped after 2 days, I wanted to scream on her behalf, which I did. Everybody knows that we should not destroy lives, but many don't know how to actually treasure life. I often used to feel overwhelming sorrow, but I know now how to transform anger and the foolishness which all human beings have into compassion, courage, and wisdom, and encourage others to do the same. In October 2006, I finally visited the Atomic Bomb Museum in Hiroshima, which I and my family never been able to physically do. I entered the building by myself and renewed my vow to work for world peace on behalf of my late parents, elder siblings, and the people of Hiroshima and the world. I hope our voices are loud enough to ensure that this must never be repeated again. I'm dedicating my life to creating cause for peace rather than treating the effect. There are still 12,301 nuclear weapons in the world, and 3,904 are actually active warheads. We are sitting on those nuclear weapons every day. And still in many people's mind, nuclear weapons are a necessary evil. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought the threat of nuclear warhead to the forefront. But how would modern nuclear detonation impact the world today? Provide stark information of the global impact of nuclear war. A group of scientists said, it doesn't matter who is bombing whom. It can be India or Pakistan or NATO and Russia. Once the smoke is released into the upper atmosphere, it spreads globally and affects everyone. What is the purpose for using a nuclear weapon to kill human beings? Many believed it was finishing the Second World War with Japan. There are two other reasons in 1945. One, they would like to see how their work performed. And two, they would like to show what Americans can do to enemies. What a dreadful thought. I no longer carry a placard to demonstrate for peace, but I have a huge banner in my heart for world peace. Hiroshima is now the most beautiful and peaceful city because there are many thousands of people practicing philosophy of deeply respecting the dignity of life. My hope is no children go through what I went through in their life. Never, ever again. So I will keep going this humanistic work of abolition of nuclear weapon activity until the last breath of my life. Thank you for giving opportunity to talk, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Kyoko. On behalf of everyone present, I would like to express our sympathy to you and your family for all that you have had to suffer. And we're also very glad to hear that you are a campaigner for peace and are still campaigning. Thank you very much indeed. We won't have any questions at this stage because I would like to introduce our other speaker, and so I should do that now. Jane Kinninmont is the Chief Executive Officer of the United Nations Association for the United Kingdom, as was mentioned already. Prior to holding this job, she was the Policy and Impact Director of the European Leadership Network, ELN, where she worked to strengthen the influence, policy relevance, and impact of the ELN's research, convening, and networks. I'm very grateful to Jane for agreeing to address us. And Jane, would you like to take the opportunity to do that directly? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Robin, and thank you to all of you for being here. But thanks especially to Kyoko for sharing the story of Hiroshima and the story of your family and your mother. I think that hearing a story like this is something that actually nobody will forget. And so I wanted to start by saying that I'm very grateful that 2 years ago I had an opportunity to visit Hiroshima. And really, I was very impressed at how the city has become a center for peace and disarmament activism. I was lucky enough to go at the invitation of a think tank called RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is a defense think tank, not a peace think tank necessarily, but it was because the governor of Hiroshima makes great efforts to connect with influential thinkers about security around the world. Of course, they very often invite peace and disarmament experts there. And they work, for example, with the UN's Office on Disarmament Affairs, where young people compete for a fellowship in disarmament, which culminates with a visit to Hiroshima to learn. But the Hiroshima authorities have also been making efforts to bring people that maybe don't think so much in terms of peace, but think in terms of defense and security and deterrence. And they want to bring them to Hiroshima to show what is the reality of these weapons and beyond the theory of deterrence, what is it that they actually do? And I think there is something very, very powerful about being able to hear the first-hand testimony and to think about the long-lasting nature of the effect. Because as we've heard now, your life, Kyoko, is still deeply affected by this. And these weapons are completely unique in terms of the physical long-lasting effects that they have, through the generations on human bodies and on the environment. And I think it's very easy to overlook this when people have abstract discussions about nuclear weapons. And it's essential to challenge the view that these weapons bring safety and security. So I wanted to start with that to say something about the power of sharing that real experience. And as many of you will know, of course, the Hibakusha were honoured with a Nobel Prize. I think it was 2 years ago, because of the importance of this first-hand testimony in reminding people why nuclear weapons should be taboo. I want to talk a bit about how the world has tried to contain the risks from nuclear weapons so far, because we do have at least the fact that, since 1945 and those bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no nuclear weapon has been detonated in a war since then. But the risks of nuclear risk are rising. So then I'll move on to talk about those risks and, most importantly, what we can all do. And I think that from our point of view at the United Nations Association UK, this issue of the global existential threat from nuclear weapons, it is absolutely at the heart of what the multilateral system is designed to deal with. And we have just celebrated in January the 80th anniversary of the first ever meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, which, as many of you will know, took place here in London, starting on the 10th of January 1946 in Methodist Central Hall, Westminster, where delegates from, at that time, 51 countries came together to try to work out how to prevent yet another world war from happening in the future. And the very first resolution that General Assembly passed was about bringing atomic weapons under control and creating a system where every country should be able to benefit from the peaceful uses of nuclear technology, such as the potential uses for energy and for health, but that no country should be able, again, to use them as a weapon. So I think that's a really important and powerful thing to remember as well, that that the world came together around this in 1946, even though the full effects of what those weapons had done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not known for many years because they were covered up. The Americans who were then in charge in Japan didn't want people to know the full extent of the damage that had been done. So it was clear that these were terrible weapons, but the full scientific information about their effects were hidden for quite some time. But the world did come together to recognize that this was a threat that all countries should work together to try to prevent and to try to control. And we still have a global consensus that nuclear weapons should never be used. There is now a majority of countries in the world who support the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We can come on to that as well. Although the problem is, of course, none of the countries who have nuclear weapons regard themselves as being bound by that treaty. Most countries in the world are members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and, that's had some success. So I think I want to start with some successes and then move to the risks. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, agreed in the 60s, has 3 pillars: that no new country should acquire nuclear weapons, that all countries should have access to the peaceful uses of the technology, and then you have the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency in using technology to verify that nuclear energy programs are not being diverted for weapons. But thirdly, of course, the Non-Proliferation Treaty does include the provision that the nuclear armed states should disarm. And it's a classic piece of diplomatic agreement where it's incredibly vague on the details. It basically just says they should start a process to disarm. And there is no such process. And so, especially in recent years, we've seen the nuclear armed states not only refusing to disarm, but in fact increasing their nuclear arsenals. And this has given rise to a real dilemma. Will it at some point be necessary for that non-proliferation treaty to fall apart if the nuclear armed states are not holding up their side of the bargain? Or is it better to have a treaty that isn't being fully implemented, but which means that there is something to hold those nuclear countries accountable and to say, look, you have these disarmament obligations? Because what we don't know is, if the non-proliferation treaty falls apart, will it be possible then to push for full disarmament, or will we end up with no shared treaty at all? And this is a big strategic question for people who want to work on disarmament. We have not seen that many countries obtain nuclear weapons. Going back to the 1960s, President Kennedy, thought that there would be some tens of countries with nuclear weapons by the 1970s. But in fact, we have 9 nuclear states. So 9 is still too many, but it is more it is less than some had feared. Partly because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, partly because these weapons are also very expensive and can be very dangerous in terms of the risks of accidents and so forth, but also because these weapons are, in the eyes of many, taboo. And we have seen success stories in Africa and in Latin America where nuclear-free regional zones have been created, which has included countries giving up on former nuclear programs or former ambitions to have nuclear programs. There are many countries that started to develop weapons programs that made, for different reasons, decisions that it wasn't worth it and stepped back from that. And we can see, if we look at Africa or if we look at Latin America, that it is perfectly possible for countries to manage their regional security without needing to have the terrible threat of nuclear weapons to back them up. And this is really something that other parts of the world should see as a model and should learn from. We also have treaties ensuring that there should be no nuclear weapons stationed in space. So even as we see nuclear risks rising, we can see that it is possible for states to deal with security in different ways. This is not to say Africa is entirely peaceful or that Latin America is entirely peaceful, but it is to say that these countries have decided they don't need nuclear weapons for their security. And of course, when everyone decides that together, then it becomes workable and it becomes possible. There is a recurring problem in the Middle East where the UN has regular conferences on trying to create a Middle East that would be free of weapons of mass destruction. But because there is one nuclear armed state there in the form of Israel, there have been ongoing attempts by other states to consider their options, to hold open at least the possibility of having nuclear weapons. And that issue remains completely stuck, something we can discuss more perhaps in the Q&A. We have also seen some successes in the past in terms of bilateral arms control between the US and Russia. This really began after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it is an example of how sometimes it takes people to come to the very brink of catastrophe before they realize the real importance of what needs to be done. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the US and Russia realized the severity of the threat. And even during the worst times of the Cold War, there were attempts to keep communication channels open between those countries and over time to build up arms control. And it's quite important and instructive that the real reductions in nuclear arsenals between the US and Russia, they began before the Cold War ended. So it wasn't that the countries needed to wait until their relations were better to disarm. They started to reduce their arsenals first, and that's really important. And there were many factors that fed into that. Partly leaders who did actually think it was a better use of their resources to curb their nuclear arsenals. But there was also a big role of public pressure, including in the West, where people were acutely conscious of the nuclear threat in a way that they are not today. And interestingly, also, some would argue there was a big role for popular culture as well. And that Ronald Reagan himself had watched films and TV programs that showed, in a fictitious context, what a nuclear apocalypse would look like, and that affected him. And, in those days, there was a huge amount of storytelling and popular culture dealing with the possibility of a nuclear apocalypse or a nuclear winter. And sometimes capturing people's imaginations in that way can actually have a real world difference. We then had some period of time where nuclear weapons seemed less relevant, although, of course, disarmament advocates note that they're always present and that they underwrite the ability of the nuclear armed states to behave in ways that other states might not. But with the end of the Cold War and later with the War on Terror, the defense and security priorities were elsewhere. We saw in the 1990s the agreement of most countries in the world to have a moratorium on nuclear testing, and the signing by most countries of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This is a really interesting one because technically it doesn't have legal force in international law. It was designed in a strange way where it would only enter into force if a number of specific countries agreed to ratify it. So essentially, it had a unique system where several countries, including the US, China, and a number of Middle Eastern states, had a veto over whether that treaty would take force. And because some of those states haven't ever signed and ratified it, the treaty technically doesn't have legal force. And yet, people abide by it. So that is an interesting example of how international law can work, even when it doesn't have the legal force. There is a kind of voluntary observation of it by most countries, with North Korea being the only country that has tested a nuclear weapon in recent years. And the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Organization has an incredible network of data gathering around the world to basically have information if a country did secretly carry out a nuclear test. And they're able to share a lot of their scientific data with people who are looking to predict earthquakes or extreme weather events, or who are looking at maritime safety, because they have this fantastic kind of scientific data collection network. And I guess the last bit of positive development we saw came, back at the time of the Obama administration, when President Obama, encouraged by people, even including Henry Kissinger, started to talk about, after the Cold War, we should really be moving towards a world without nuclear weapons, and we should all do that in a multilateral fashion. But that dream never came to pass. Obama did make some progress in bilateral arms control with Russia, but never really went effectively down that route of multilateral nuclear disarmament. And we have a problem now where all of the nuclear armed states would agree that they don't believe in unilateral disarmament. Fair enough, I say, but they also aren't doing anything on multilateral disarmament either. So there does need to be pressure on them. Right now, we are seeing things go the other way, and that has really been the case. And really, it's driven, I would argue, by the resurgence of competition for global influence. You might even say global hegemony, by the sense that the apparent victory of the West in the Cold War was not assured, that Russia and the US would still compete for influence, and that for Russia, nuclear weapons are one of the main ways in which it can still claim to be a global power. It's not super strong economically, but its nuclear weapons, whether we like it or not, have given it an ability to blackmail other countries, and have also meant that every US president will want to sit down with the Russians at some point, because they need to talk about nuclear weapons. We also, of course, have the rise of China and the growing rivalry between the US and China. And China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than either the US or Russia, but it is rebuilding. It's building it up pretty quickly. So we have this worrying situation where there is growing friction between these big powers, and a nuclear arms race has become part of that friction. That's particularly bad because we can now imagine scenarios where there could be hot conflicts in which those nuclear armed states are involved. So the argument that some in favor of nuclear deterrence is that if we look back over the last 80 years, we haven't had another world war. And they would say at least one of the reasons we haven't had a world war is because nuclear deterrence prevents or disincentivizes those nuclear armed states from fighting one another. Now, obviously, speaking at a UNA and CND Cymru meeting, I'm imagining that not many people here agree with that thesis. But it is a thesis that has been quite hard to disprove. We've had this period where there have been a lot of wars in the world. There haven't been a lot of wars in Europe, and there hasn't been a conflict between the so-called great powers, such as the US, Russia, and China, since the Second World War. And some people would argue that is because of economic globalization. Other people would argue it's because of nuclear weapons. We can't really prove this either way, in my opinion. But what we do know is that the possibility of a conflict like that is no longer unthinkable. whether you're in favor of disarmament or whether you believe that nuclear deterrence has been effective for the last 8 decades, we can now see that there are plausible scenarios where, for example, China could invade Taiwan and it could get to the point of a nuclear standoff. We have seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine that, 6 months into that invasion, the US government thought there was an up to 50% chance that a so-called tactical nuclear weapon could be used by Russia in Ukraine. That hasn't happened. But perhaps one reason that it hasn't happened is that Russia actually wasn't facing defeat in Ukraine. But the sort of US and NATO assessments were that Russia was reserving itself the option that if it was going to be defeated by Ukrainian fighters with support from NATO, that it might then try to tip the balance by using a nuclear weapon. And that even if that was detonating a weapon over the Black Sea or something that didn't involve hitting a major population center, it would frighten people into coming to an agreement to end the war on Ukraine on terms that were more favorable to Russia. And it's a really grim truth that I don't like to say, but Russia has benefited from having nuclear weapons in terms of its ability to invade and continue to occupy parts of Ukraine. It would be much more likely that Western forces would have got more involved in that conflict if they were not deterred partly by Russian nuclear weapons. And so we see that, yes, those big powers have managed to avoid a world war, but it has come at a cost of nuclear blackmail and of a country with nuclear weapons being able to throw its weight around more than others. Russia has obviously faced reputational costs. It seems even its friends in China have been quite unhappy at the nuclear hints that Putin has dropped. But it has ushered in a new period where an increasing number of countries are now starting to think, if we're in a world of nuclear blackmail and we see these big, powerful countries increasing their arsenals, why should we stay in the Non-Proliferation Treaty? We hear this coming a lot from Ukraine. There is a narrative in Ukraine that they gave up their nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War and now look where it got them. It's not quite as simple as that. They had Soviet nuclear weapons stationed in Ukraine, which wasn't necessarily a program that Ukraine could keep. But it feeds a growing belief that we're hearing in multiple countries where people are feeling very insecure and starting to think that nuclear weapons could be a means to obtain security. And that's a belief that really has to be challenged. But ultimately, the nuclear armed states themselves are contributing to this problem in that they are saying to the rest of the world, we need these weapons for our security. This is what big powers do. This is what keeps us all safe, but you can't have them. And that is becoming increasingly unsustainable in a world where many countries are rising as powers. Many of them feel insecure. Many of them don't trust allies to protect them. And many of them are also saying, on many fronts, we feel entitled to what the West has had in the past. So you are seeing more discussion, in Asia and in the Middle East about countries potentially considering new nuclear weapons as something that would help their security. And even here in Europe, countries that have been strong proponents of arms control have changed their position out of fear. We've seen Sweden and Finland, of course, join NATO and come under the NATO nuclear umbrella as a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the use of nuclear threats there. We're seeing this at all levels because we're also seeing a number of countries in Eastern Europe start to pull out of the Convention on Landmines. So there is this problem where fear is driving an arms race. And of course, we can all see that that's a vicious circle. but how do we go out to stop it? We've also seen, of course, in the Middle East, the US and Israel bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, saying that they wanted to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, but knowing that those very facilities that they bombed were under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we've had an unprecedented situation where a country that is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was bombed by two nuclear armed states, one of which doesn't sign that treaty at all. And this happened on a pretext that the International Atomic Energy Agency had criticized Iran for not being transparent enough, but that was primarily due to information they were asking Iran to provide from 20 years previously. There are, of course, other reasons that the US and Israel wanted to attack Iran. Israel regards Iran as a profound security threat, doesn't want it to have a missile program. Iran has said plenty of very threatening things towards Israel. And of course, it's also a very repressive government, etc. But none of these context factors changes the fact that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has really been put at risk by this type of behavior and the refusal of European countries to call it out and to acknowledge what a threat it is to the peaceful multilateral architecture. If a country can be a member of the NPT and have international inspections and still be vulnerable in this way. I don't want to go on for too long, so we can talk more perhaps in the discussion about the rise of new technologies and what those might also mean for nuclear risks. But I think a few thoughts on sort of where things go from here. 6 days ago, the last remaining bilateral arms control treaty between the US and Russia expired. New start. We are now in a place where there is no arms control treaty between the US and Russia to deal with nuclear weapons. We saw over last weekend US officials saying that they believe that China conducted a nuclear test secretly in 2020. I have no idea whether this is true, but we know that internationally there's no evidence of this, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization has said it has no such evidence. There are worries that the US might start to test nuclear weapons itself, and that could also encourage others to start doing it. We know that nuclear tests themselves can be very harmful depending when and where they are conducted. We have in April the upcoming review conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which happens every 5 years. No one's very optimistic about the outcome, but the UK and other governments will have to send officials there. They will have to spend 2 weeks in New York talking to countries from around the world about what they're doing to reduce nuclear risks and to disarm. So it is an opportunity for global scrutiny of UK policy. Last night, I was in the British Parliament with a number of MPs who are committed to disarmament, and we had Melissa Park, who's the executive director of ICAN, the organisation that I'm sure you all know that campaigned for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, briefing British parliamentarians. They did tell us that currently there is very little discussion in the British Parliament about nuclear weapons in general, and basically no discussion about the fact that this big international conference is coming up in April and what will the UK actually plan to say there. Of course, there's a lot going on in domestic politics in Britain, but the parliamentarians we spoke to also noted that a lot of MPs are in Parliament for the first time. A lot of ministers are in their jobs for the first time. People don't necessarily know or care about nuclear weapons, or if they care about it, they may fear that they don't know enough. So there is also a need to educate and, yes, pressurize parliamentarians, and writing to your MPs if you think it's appropriate on these issues is helpful. Because if people don't write to them and if voters don't raise it, they will take away the conclusion that nobody cares. Later in the year, in November, there will be the first ever review conference for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is now signed by over 100 countries around the world. The UK is not a signatory to that. Currently, no British diplomats plan to attend. But you could ask your parliamentarians if they would attend, because although the British government will not go, there will be opportunities for members of parliament to go to the conference and to meet with parliamentarians from other countries and talk about how we can all work together to promote disarmament and reduce nuclear risks. And perhaps also write to your MP and suggest to them that British diplomats should be going, even if they don't sign up to the treaty, to hear what the rest of the world has to say. Because if you believe in multilateralism, if you believe in listening to global public opinion, you cannot just ignore and write off a treaty that most states in the world have signed. So they could at least be having that dialogue. We also need actions that go beyond the nuclear issue itself. We need to be investing in conflict prevention. And sadly, with the recent cuts in international development aid, the UK is scaling back its investment in conflict prevention. That is not a good idea at this time when we see that for more than a decade, the number of armed conflicts around the world has been escalating. And most of those do not involve nuclear armed states, but most nuclear experts worry that the highest risks of getting a nuclear war would be some conflict that starts out small, but involves nuclear armed states backing different sides could escalate. So generally investing in conflict prevention matters, and restoring the sense that the public cares about international development and about international humanitarian law. Because at the end of the day, that is also what the nuclear taboo is relating to. It is, the belief that has been enshrined in international law for many years that civilians should be protected. Nuclear weapons, as we've heard, are by their nature completely indiscriminate. They are not going to distinguish in any way between someone who is a soldier or a newborn baby or a fetus in the womb. So we have a broader problem where on a daily basis, the relevance of international law and human rights is being questioned, and it's really important to counter that. I'm going to stop here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and having more of a discussion with you. Thank you very much for having me.